Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in Lisbon. This week was Frankfurt on Tuesday for a conference and Lisbon on Thursday on a conference. I don't need to explain you the difference between being in Frankfurt and being in Lisbon. Much pleasant being here in this beautiful environment as well. My talk today will be about the experience of the SSM entering the second year. And let me be very clear from the very beginning. I mean, the creation of the SSM has been an incredible success story in terms of European construction. Probably it's the most relevant change since the introduction of the euro in terms of European architecture. And, well, the fact that we have been able to put in place a system in a little bit more than 1 year up and running and at full steam is a huge success. Having said that, first of all, I mean, we have to also to be aware that probably the completion of banking union is decades away from now. Completing banking union will require a very long time. And at the same time, I'm not here to praise the SSM or the ECB. I'm here to try to highlight the challenges that we have ahead of us. So my position is of a constructive criticism. The constructive part finishes here, and we will go now for the criticism. But don't take this as a criticism to the SSM. It's simply that I think that the value is in the critical points. Before entering into what I see, you know, the challenges for the SSM, let me talk a little bit about the global framework and the Eurozone framework. On the global framework, let me state some obvious things, but that I think that are necessary. First of all, financial globalization has gone in parallel with economic globalization. But the financial crisis has reminded us of the dark side of financial globalization. With the crisis, we saw contagion, we saw increased volatility, we saw systemic banking crisis in several countries, either in a direct impact because of the, impact of the subprime crisis in the US, or like in the case of Spain, a real estate bubble combined with a Eurozone crisis. Financial globalization has had a dark side, and we are now experiencing that. The response of authorities, naturally, has been to reset financial regulation. We have a more detailed regulation and a tougher regulation. On the more detailed regulation, let's remind ourselves Dodd-Frank, not just the law itself, the fact that, the secondary legislation coming from Dodd-Frank's, it's counted in the 1,000 pieces rather than the 100 pieces. And in Europe, the European Banking Authority standards are a good indication of how detailed the new regulation has become. Of course, in this new regulation, we have also resolution as a big novelty, as Charles was indicating this morning. We have not just a more detailed regulation, a tougher regulation, we also have a redundant regulation. For instance, for capital, and I will be mentioning this during my speaking points, for capital requirements of banks, we have Pillar 1, we have Pillar 2, is REP in the European jargon. We have stress tests, because stress tests in the negative scenario, there's a minimum capital that banks should hold, so stress tests also are a way to determine banks' capital, and what I would call resolution capital, MREL, in the European jargon. So it's more detailed, it's tougher, it's redundant. Independently of these elements, the dark side of financial integration, the reaction of the authorities, we have seen, a fragmentation of the international financial system. To some extent, this has been due to market participants' actions, but it's also true that authorities have contributed with some ring-fencing measures in the crisis, some ring-fencing measures that even within the Eurozone are still present, although nobody wants to talk too much about that reality. So on top of all these reactions, we have a tendency to disintegration of the financial globalization that we have seen in the last decades. The key question here, and it's not for this conference, maybe for next year, is whether we can have economic globalization without financial globalization. I'm not going to answer that question. My suspicion is that probably the answer is no, but probably that's not the subject for today. On the euro area, in terms of general framework, the single financial market has been severely affected by the crisis. And even in the Eurozone, the renationalization of financial markets have been even greater, I would say, than in the wider European Union. Let me put a very clear example. Interbank market in Europe was gone in 2007. The summer 2007, it started with the interbank market disappearing. 9 years, almost 9 years after the start of the crisis, the interbank market has not returned. We have no interbank market in the Eurozone. So this is an indication that the damage of integration that we have seen has been huge and continues to be very high. We are by far not recovering the levels of integration we saw before the crisis, even with banking union and all that we are doing. Well, this is kind of the general setup for my comments. Let me now go directly to what I perceive as the challenges on the side of the single supervisory mechanism. The first challenge comes from a very unstable framework. Unstable because we are still seeing, regulations being either devised or implemented. On the side of implementation, the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive, the BRRD, the Single Resolution Board, it started in January this year, so they are starting to begin with the recovery plans, with the measures they are taking on an institution by institution basis. This is something that is still evolving. We have Basel III in place, we have the BRRD being implemented this year, and last but not least, we have Basel IV, what we call Basel IV. When I am with the regulators, I will say so-called Basel IV. It's not me calling it Basel IV, it's just these evil market participants. Basel IV, that in the end, it's a relatively important thing. We can be talking about a 30% increase in risk-weighted assets, and that means a 30% increase in the capital requirement for banks. This has to be finalized at the end of the year. We have the promise of the leaders of the G20, of the GHOS, the governors and heads of supervision, that there will not be any significant increases in capital. But frankly speaking, the distance between the proposals that we see out today and that not significant increase in capital, I hope that they don't think that 30% increase is not significant, because then we are in a trouble. So although this is still to be seen whether we will end up, that's another element of instability in the framework. What is the problem for the banks? If you want to plan your capital 3 years ahead, it's almost mission impossible. You have to think about Pillar 1 charge. You have to think about Pillar 2, which is still evolving in the SSM. I will mention it later on. You have to think about your leverage ratio. You have to think about the countercyclical capital buffers, how they may kick in. You have to think about the stress tests and the capital implication that this may have. You have to think about resolution capital, MREL or TLAC. In a perfect system, all the signals coming from all these areas would be consistent. But we are talking about systems that are based in people, and people tend to have different interpretation of similar things. So the fact that each of these pieces is run by different authorities, or even with a single authority like the ECB, but with several hats, will imply that for the banks it's going to be extremely difficult to plan their capital needs 3 years in advance. This may have consequences. If there's an economic recovery that takes place and banks have not been able to plan their capital ahead, we can face a situation of credit crunch and banks not being able to finance economic recovery because simply they were not able to foresee their capital needs in advance. So that's the first problem, the unstable framework. The second problem I would like to mention is that we are in an extremely complex framework. I was a couple of weeks ago in a conference organized by Goldman Sachs in Paris, what they call the European Financials Conference. I was talking to equity investors and fixed income investors, and they are at a loss. Look, I'm not a bank. I'm the chairman of the Spanish Banking Association. I was a former Director General of Regulation at the Bank of Spain. This year, I had 7 one-to-one meetings with investors. Why? Because suddenly, trying to understand what is going on in regulation is probably key for them to make the decision to invest or not to invest. I was extremely surprised. It's the first year I have been in such a demand. It's pretty bizarre that when you go to a financials conference, investors do not just want to talk to bankers to see how the banks are doing, but they also want to talk with someone that knows a little bit about regulation so that they can understand what is going on. An indication, the acronyms. I would suggest that you don't try to take notes, and I would suggest to the simultaneous translator that he does not try to translate all that I'm going to say very fast, because it's going to be mission impossible. The acronyms: CRD, CRR4, EBA, SSM, SRM, ESAs, SRB, SRNs, NCAs, ECAP, ELAB, SET1, Tier 1, Tier 2, COCOS, AT1, MREL, TLAC, SEP, SREP, GSIBs, DSIBs, OSIS, LSIS, AQR, BCBS, ESRB, COREP, FINREP, RIS, MDA, GSTs. And I'm sure that this list is not yet complete. So if you are a fixed income investor, an equity investor, you need to know about all these things. Frankly speaking, this is not easy. I have to confess, almost every 2 to 3 months, I find myself with a new acronym I know nothing about. Having been in this business for many years, it's pretty worrying, but at the same time, you just naturally include the new acronym in your brain and move forward again. So we are in a very complex environment, and this is taking a toll on investors. Why? Because when they meet with banks, I had a dinner in that meeting in Paris, and one of the investors was telling me, I want an equity story. I'm tired of the banks telling me about all these capital requirements, all the cost cutting. I want an interesting equity story. I want to invest, even if it is riskier. Just please tell me something that is attractive as a bank investor. Well, with all this world that we are in, we are becoming not just, let's say, not very profitable business, but a pretty boring business as well. Third element of criticism, the supervisory review and evaluation process, which is the Pillar 2. The Pillar 2 is a very relevant part of supervision. I think it was one of the positive things about Basel II was this 3-pillar structure. And the second pillar is about supervision. It's a bank-by-bank assessment of their capital needs. So you have the Pillar 1, the rules, and then you have the Pillar 2 to say, well, independently of the rules, let's see how the bank is, and let's try to ascertain whether they need, more, or in principle even less capital. This never fly, this part of less capital. The supervisory review and evaluation process within the Eurozone is extremely structural. It's almost a Pillar 1 within Pillar 2. Why? Because it's very difficult to supervise 120 banks in 19 countries with different characteristics, business models, with different national competent authorities, philosophies of supervision. So by having a very rules-based approach, you can ensure a kind of a level playing field across these 120 banks in 19 countries. So that's the advantage. You know that with this very structured Pillar 2, very detailed Pillar 2, you know that there's not going to be a unlevel playing field between a Spanish, a Portuguese, a French, or a German bank. And that has advantages. Let's recognize that. What is the problem? The problem is that it is so structured. that in fact banks have been obliged to publish their Pillar 2 surcharges to the market because it is so automatic that there's no way that they can keep this as internal information without risking, litigation with investors later down the road when there are problems because, well, I mean, you had this Pillar 2 surcharge that was almost automatic and you didn't reveal it to the market, I'm going to sue you. That was information that was very relevant for the market. So the way the SREP is going is a little bit worrying. And I understand what is happening. I insist, 120 banks, 19 national competent authorities. It's very tempting to do, this homogeneous new approach by writing a lot of rules. But I think that going forward, this really is eliminating the nature of Pillar 2 as a bank-specific surcharge. I think that there's time for things to evolve, and over the years we may see this changing. Fourth area of criticism, the communication challenges. Charles was mentioning here at the beginning of the year the problems coming from the SREP decision, the maximum distributable amount. It was a combination of something that was in the directive. COCO's remuneration stops at the same time that dividends and bonuses. So the COCO investors are on the hook in case of banks not being able to distribute their profits. By the way the decision was taken, it was very clear for the market that the distance between the bank's requirements in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 and this trigger of MDA, they stopped to distribution, the banks were very close. They panicked. We had a huge row on the COCO's market. Interestingly, we had a huge row on the equity markets because investors were using the equity markets to cover from the risk of the COCO's market. COCO market became illiquid. If I have a COCO of Deutsche Bank and I cannot sell it because it's very liquid, what I do, I just short sell Deutsche Bank shares. But then led to collapses of the shares of many banks and a huge mess. It's not so much that the decision was probably wrong. And I think that the decision is probably wrong because the SSM has announced that they are going to change their decision for this year. For me, what was striking is that for months, nobody from the SSM was going out and speaking in public about their thoughts. They were thinking, well, this is the markets, the banks and the markets. We are solvency supervisors. Solvency supervisors do not intervene in market communication. And this was true for national competent authorities. That would have been the perfect philosophy for the Bank of Spain, for any national competent authorities. You just don't interfere with the market, because if you communicate too much with the market, you may end up creating, a greater volatility. But I think that the SSM is different. The SSM is different because the degree of attention of markets to anything that the SSM does is huge. Whenever Danielle Nui delivers a speech, her speech is going to be read, immediately on time by all the relevant market participants, fixed income investors and equity investors all across Europe. The complexity does not help. There are many variables around, and the fact that, we have this complex environment with so many acronyms, as I was telling you, does not help this communication effort. So I think that here the SSM has to be more attentive and proactive than national competent authorities in terms of communication to the market. I think that they need to decide what to communicate, when to communicate, and how to communicate. I think that they are getting better. I see that Danielle and Sabine are both going out and speaking in public and being, very clear when they change a decision, or where they are starting to change a decision. They are being very transparent with the market. That helps a lot, and that should continue going forward. The level of scrutiny of the markets on the SSM is not going to be reduced over time. This is just a structural element of the new system. It was not like that for national competent authorities, but for the SSM is different. So fourth challenge, the communication challenge. Fifth element of doubt. The SSM board. Supervision within the Eurozone is based on a board comprised by national competent authorities and by SSM, if you want, ECB board members, not the ECB board members, but the board members appointed by the ECB to this board. So it is not supervised by a small group of people. It is supervised by a very big group of people. Peter is here, he knows better than me, but probably we are talking about 25-member board with alternate sitting around 50 people in a room. 4 director generals, of course, are in charge of the technical work as well as the national competent authorities back home. The key for me is that although I think that you can regulate via a committee, and we have proofs of that. We have the Basel Committee, we have the European Banking Authority, CEPS when I was chairing that. You can regulate effectively via a committee. I don't think that that's an issue. But can you regulate via, can you supervise, via a committee? I'm not sure that you can supervise institutions via a committee. You need something that is more executive, more direct, faster. Another issue is the role of the national competent authorities and the role of the European Banking Authority. This system of consultation to the national competent authorities, to the EBA, is putting a lot of friction in the system. The timing of decision is extremely slow. Licensing, fit and proper, this is being recognized by SEM. The problem is that by design, on many of these areas, they do not have, the full responsibility. They have to share the competences with the national competent authorities. They have to consult the EBA in some other occasions for the interpretation of certain parts. That does not help. You have this big board, and on top of that, you have all these internal processes with a lot of friction. Going forward, a more streamlined process is needed, and maybe this can be achieved through a greater role of the director generals, of the staff of the ECB. Being from a national member state, that decision sometimes is a little bit difficult, because you say, well, maybe these people are farther from our sensitivities. Maybe we can talk to the national competent authorities and they will understand us better. And it is true, in the short run, this is going to be like that. But at the same time, I think that in the long run, you need a more executive approach where the director generals are the ones that are in charge of the banks, and the SSM, they overview the decisions, but probably not taking the decision, just reviewing it, more like a review board than as a full decision-making board. And I know this is very revolutionary, and probably even my banks would not agree with what I'm saying. Sometimes that can happen. 6 elements of problems. The interaction, the interplay between the single supervisory mechanism and the single resolution board. Charles was making the question why these were separate entities. And the only response is that from a technical perspective, in my viewpoint, there's no reason. The only reasons could be political, but maybe it's better not to enter into these issues. Resolution issues are going to be key in the future. They are extremely complex. We have to understand that resolution is done legal entity by legal entity. On all that Charles was indicating, don't fool yourself. Solvency is about consolidated group. Resolution is by legal entities liquidation, potential liquidation. So the world of resolution is extremely complex. On top of that, resolution authorities have very wide powers. There was this decision taken in Portugal by the end of the year. I asked my people, can that be done? And the answer was yes, based on financial stability considerations. So the discretionary powers that we have given these authorities, for very good reasons, is enormous. Going forward, I think that the only way you are going to see the shape of that discretion being determined is through litigation in the legal court of justice. So, Charles, you were right. You have to become a litigation lawyer specialized in bank resolution if you want to have a brilliant career. We are going to see a lot of litigation because we have authorities with a very wide set of powers. Here, the coordination between the single supervisory mechanism and the single resolution board is going to be crucial. So far, I have to say that all indicates that the spirit of cooperation is going very well. But of course, we are in the first year. In the first year, if the spirit of cooperation is not going well, what can you expect? Going forward, there will be frictions, and I'm not saying that there should not be friction. What I expect is that when frictions do occur, and they will occur, that there is a system that allows for this to be compensated. Seventh element of shadows, if you want, in the SSM functioning. The gold plating at the European and national level, they continue. There are many instances where the national rulemaking, even the Court of Justice decisions, seem to ignore that we are in a European framework. In many areas, we are still operating as if the SSM was not being created. I could include in these elements also the contradiction between pushing for banking union or for capital markets union and at the same time pushing for measures that fragment the market, the financial transaction tax, the structural reform of the banking sector. These are measures that will tend to fragment the market because they are taken, not for the EU as a whole, not for the Eurozone as a whole, but for subparts of it. And last but not least, I'm afraid that the national champions mentality is still prevalent in many of our countries. We are creating the banking union, but we are not fully believing in the benefits of banking union going forward. We continue to be attached to the old concepts. Let me finalize by mentioning the banking union project. The SSM is just a component of a broader project, and I'm not talking about the European Deposit Insurance Scheme. Of course, we need a European Deposit Insurance Scheme. Of course, this is not going to be very easy. Our German colleagues are in deep disagreement with the need of our European Deposit Insurance Scheme, but for me, it's a no-brainer. That's part of banking union, and it may take 20 years, but it should be part of it. But I'm also talking about capital markets union, whose success is key to complement banking union. And we are talking here about a process that probably will require decades. The Giovannini report on the securities markets liquidation problems, that was 14 years ago. And we are still, trying to eliminate the barriers. Creating the capital markets union is going to be, if banking union is a difficult project, capital markets union is a Herculean project, crucial for Europe. What is my fear? My fear is that, generally speaking, with banking union, with all the resolution measures on the bank, with all the capital measures on the banks, we are front-loading the reforms of the banking sector. We are going to reduce the size of the banking sector in the next decade, and at the same time, Europe will not have still a capital markets union to compensate for that reduction on the size of the banking sector. We run the risk of, yet again, a credit crunch when recovery takes place in the Eurozone. And, well, let's hope that recovery takes place in the Eurozone in the next decade, because otherwise we will be talking about other issues. But it's not just about capital markets union. Also, the private sector needs to play a role. If there are no pan-European banks within a decade, banking union will fail, and we may see another renationalization of financial markets in the next crisis. So mergers, consolidation in an overbanked Eurozone area are key going forward. And the single supervisory mechanism cannot force the banks to merge. This is a corporate decision that has to be taken by the banks. And without that element of private decision, all that we have done probably will be in vain. As you see, there are many areas, not all of them under the control of the single supervisory mechanism, that are key for the success of this project of banking union. Let me conclude with the constructive criticism idea. As you see, I have been more critical than constructive. Well, the value is in the criticism, but of course, I do agree the creation of the single supervisory mechanism has been probably one of the few positive surprises of the Eurozone crisis of the last decade. We have to recognize that, but at the same time, we need to understand that there is still a lot to be done in terms of perfectioning the system to the standards that is needed to comply with the functions of financing the European and the Eurozone economy. Thank you very much.